Mason Whitlock only brought a hand-built engine on an old utility cart, its casing still streaked with oil and its welds left unpolished. But in an exhibition hall worth millions of dollars, CEO Charlotte Bancroft looked him up and down and laughed. "You actually think this scrap heap belongs on the same stage as our technology?" Mason said nothing. His young daughter stood beside him and lowered her head, clutching a worn sketchbook to her chest. No one in that room could have imagined that within minutes, the very engine they had mocked would ignite a $50 million bidding war that left every investor in the building fighting for the right to own a piece of it. If you believe the most overlooked person in the room sometimes holds the most valuable thing in it, stay until the end. The rain came down in a fine mist over the outskirts of Detroit, too thin to be called a storm but cold enough to cling to everything it touched. It tapped against the corrugated tin roof of a narrow garage in a rhythm that might have lulled most people to sleep. Inside, Mason Whitlock had not slept. 3 bare bulbs on a cord lit the space with yellow warmth. The smell was motor oil and metal shavings and something faintly electrical, the smell of a machine being coaxed toward life. A scarred workbench ran along one wall, covered with hand files, spent spark plugs saved for reference, and a notebook filled margin to margin with calculations written in pencil, because Mason always expected to be wrong and wanted to correct himself when he was. He was 34 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested more. His shirt was a faded blue chambray, cuffs rolled to his elbows. His hands were what told the real story calloused at the palm, stained in the creases with oil that no soap fully lifted, steady as a surgeon's when he worked. He carried himself quietly, with the posture of someone who had learned that taking up less space was sometimes the only strategy available. In the corner, on a folding chair with a wool blanket around her small legs, Hannah Whitlock slept, 7 years old, with her mother's dark eyelashes and her father's habit of going quiet when something mattered. She was holding a composition notebook with a cracked cover her mother's, filled with notes that were part science journal, part personal correspondence addressed to no one in particular. Hannah carried it everywhere. She said it made her feel less far from her mother, and Mason had never once asked her to put it down. An hour before, she had looked up and asked something he was still turning over in his mind. "If your engine works, will we have to sell the house?" He had not promised her they would not. He had kissed the top of her head, adjusted her foam earplugs, and told her he needed one more run tonight. What Mason was building was not magic. It was the product of roughly 6,000 hours of trial, revision, and failure spread across 4 years of serious work. The engine was a compact design positioned in the narrow space between conventional combustion and full electrification, a space that most engineers had not bothered to develop because commercial pressure always ran toward extremes. It used a short-loop thermal recovery system, a mechanically fast pressure valve, and a combustion chamber geometry he had arrived at through a combination of textbook analysis and hard-won destruction testing. He had burned through 11 chamber prototypes before the geometry stopped failing. He had built it to be used in light trucks, emergency generators, agricultural equipment, places where power demand changed constantly, and where the people maintaining the equipment were more likely to have a socket wrench than a laptop. He had tried before to be taken seriously. He had sent technical summaries to 3 companies. One had not replied. One had replied with a form letter. One had offered $20,000 to acquire the design outright, approximately 1/30th of what it had cost him in time and materials. He had declined. That evening, he found an email he had been waiting on. The Bancroft Motion Investor Showcase had confirmed his slot in the Independent Inventor Exhibition space, a secondary track, a courtesy access point. But it was a room with real investors in it, people who had the authority to fund something or kill it. Hannah had clapped when he told her. He looked at the engine for a long time after she fell asleep. He understood what he was walking into. He knew that in a venue where a company was presenting a polished machine with a marketing team and a media strategy, a man arriving with a hand-welded frame and a binder of pencil calculations would not be treated as a peer. He had spent enough of his life in rooms where people decided what something was worth before they looked at it closely. He turned off 2 of the 3 lights, put his hand flat against the engine housing, and felt the even warmth of a machine that had done what it was supposed to do. Then he decided they were going. The Bancroft Motion Investor Showcase occupied the top 2 floors of a glass-paneled building near the Detroit River, designed with the specific intention of making money feel comfortable. Concept vehicles sat on raised platforms under clean white light. A bank of LED screens cycled through efficiency statistics and emission projections, the vocabulary of transformation, rendered in a typeface that cost more per letter than most people's hourly wage. Charlotte Bancroft moved through it with the ease of someone who had built this environment and knew exactly what it was supposed to do. She was 29 years old, with a manner that suggested she had learned very early to give nothing away. She had taken over Bancroft Motion from her late father 3 years ago, and she had spent those years proving that the board's initial assumptions about her were wrong. The effort had left a precision in her that could read, depending on context, as confidence or coldness. Today was the most important day the company had seen under her leadership. The showcase was the centerpiece of a capital raise that could push Bancroft Motion's valuation into territory that would change what was possible. If the flagship drivetrain performed the way her engineering team had promised, the funding would follow. If it did not, she would be managing fallout well into the following year. Connor Blake, head of engineering, intercepted her at 7:45. He was 42, with a broad-shouldered confidence assembled over 2 decades of knowing which projects to take credit for and which risks to avoid. He reported that the flagship prototype was ready. He said there were no concerns worth mentioning. There was, in fact, a concern worth mentioning. A junior engineer named Tyler had flagged 3 days earlier that under high-resistance load simulation, thermal output was climbing faster than the models predicted. Connor had reviewed the flag, determined the numbers remained within acceptable tolerance, and told Tyler that acceptable tolerance meant acceptable. Charlotte asked about the independent inventor list. Connor mentioned a mechanic named Mason Whitlock with a self-built engine and made clear what he thought of the matter. Charlotte told her event coordinator to keep independent exhibitors in the auxiliary space and away from the primary demonstration area. She moved on. She had larger things to manage. When Mason arrived with Hannah, he parked near the service entrance. A security guard directed him to the freight elevator. 2 attendants looked at the engine frame on the utility cart and said nothing, but their silence communicated their assessment clearly enough. Hannah stayed close to her father. She was observant in the way children who have spent time in hospitals become observant reading rooms, reading people, deciding quickly where safety was and was not. She could feel the way people were looking at them. Mason crouched beside her before they entered the elevator. He said, "We're here to let the engine run. That's the only thing we're here for, not to ask anyone to do us a favor." She took his hand, and they went in. In the auxiliary space, Mason began setting up. A few younger engineers drifted over, curious about the recovery loop, the unusual valve placement, the compact thermal geometry. One started to speak, but Connor Blake appeared in the doorway and looked at the engine the way someone looks at an object already categorized. He said at a volume that carried, "Did you build this in a barn?" It was not a question. It was a public classification. This thing is primitive. This man is beneath consideration. Mason looked up from his checklist, met Connor's eyes briefly, then returned to checking a wire connection. He did not respond. Connor noted the silence and did not like it. He told Mason the testing protocol's independent exhibitors could access the load testing rig only after the primary demonstration concluded, then left. Mason understood the message. He continued working. The incident that would define the morning happened approximately 40 minutes before the main demonstration began. Charlotte was conducting a walkthrough because Samuel Grant and Abigail Monroe, 2 of the most significant investors present, had asked to see the full floor. Samuel Grant was 58 years old and had made a practice of forming his own opinions before listening to anyone else's. His father had worked in a machine shop, and he had never fully lost the instinct for recognizing when someone was doing real work. The group stopped in front of Mason's engine. Mason was adjusting cable routing when they arrived. Hannah stood nearby, holding the sketchbook. An older investor asked what the device was designed for. Mason answered directly. Light, duty trucks, emergency power generation, agricultural and industrial applications requiring stable output under variable load. Connor spoke before the investor could respond, in the tone that is affable and contemptuous, in precisely the combination most effective at producing laughter. He said that anyone with a welder and a pile of salvaged parts could describe themselves as an innovator these days. A few people smiled. The investor who had asked did not. Charlotte felt the group's attention and took the opening. She asked whether the engine had been certified by any independent testing facility. Mason said he had not yet been through full third-party certification because the cost was beyond his current budget. Charlotte said, "So you've brought an uncertified prototype to an investor event, and you're asking people to take your word for it." Mason said he was not asking anyone to take his word for anything. He was asking to run the engine under the standard load test in front of anyone who wanted to watch, using the facility's own measurement systems. A test, not a testimony. Charlotte looked at the engine's mismatched metal surfaces, the hand-laid welds, the carefully labeled but visually imperfect assembly. She looked at Mason's worn clothes, and she said it. "You actually think something built in a garage like this belongs on the same stage as Bancroft Motion's technology?" The words landed hard not because they were shouted, but because they were measured and certain in the way dismissals are when the person delivering them has the power to make them stick. Hannah's chin dropped. She pressed the sketchbook against her chest with both arms. Beside her, Mason put a hand on her shoulder, and for a moment the geometry of the scene was clear to everyone watching. A child absorbing a public humiliation on her father's behalf. A journalist near the doorway began recording. Charlotte added, "This event isn't a venue for dreams welded together with hope." She meant it to be decisive. It was, but in its decisiveness it revealed something, and at least one person in the group noticed. Hannah said, very quietly, "My dad didn't weld it with hope. He welded it with nights he didn't sleep." The group went still. Several people looked at Mason rather than the engine for the first time. Samuel Grant looked at him carefully at his hands, at the engine, at the child who had just said the truest thing in the room. Charlotte said there might be time after the main demonstration for a load test. She walked away. Samuel lingered a second longer than the others, then walked on. Mason sat down beside Hannah. She asked if he was upset. He said, "No, people laugh before they hear the truth." She nodded once, seriously, the way she did when she was deciding to believe something. The phone call from the bank came through at 9:54. The representative was professionally sympathetic, 2 months overdue, 30 days before the lien process would move forward. Mason said he understood, ended the call, and arranged his face before turning around. Hannah had heard enough. She did not ask what category the call belonged to. She already knew. She opened her mother's notebook instead. Near the back, in careful handwriting, "Don't let people who measure things in money be the ones who decide what your work is worth." Rebecca had been a middle school science teacher who wrote in her notebooks the way some people pray to put language around what she believed, so it wouldn't dissolve when things got hard. After Rebecca died, Mason had spent 3 months barely touching the engine. He went back to it because Hannah asked him to, when she was 5 years old. She had found him in the garage sitting in front of the covered components and said, "Mom would be mad if you left it." He had laughed not what he expected and started uncovering them. Samuel Grant returned to the auxiliary space alone that morning. He asked how long Mason had been working on the engine. 6 years, Mason said, the last 3 most productive. Samuel asked to see the test data. Mason handed him 3 sheets of handwritten documentation: temperature curves, power output measurements, fuel consumption per cycle, and a complete log of component failures and their causes. 12 valve failures across 5 prototypes, 3 bearing failures, 1 combustion event that had scorched the garage wall. The data was not beautiful, it was real. People who were inventing convenient results showed only successes. This man had written down every way he had failed and what the failure had taught him. Samuel handed the sheets back. He said he would like to see the engine run when the opportunity arose, and he walked away. The primary demonstration began at 11 on the main floor. Charlotte spoke well. She described the flagship hybrid drivetrain as a bridge between conventional combustion and full electrification, reliable under variable conditions, manufacturable at scale. The room gave the performance the attention it was designed to receive. Connor stood off to one side, with the expression of a man watching a plan unfold. Tyler, the junior engineer, watched the thermal readout from the side of the room. The temperature line was climbing faster than the baseline. He looked at Connor. Connor shook his head. When the load sequence advanced to sustained high-resistance operation, the kind a vehicle encounters on a grade with a full payload, the temperature continued to rise. The system controller automatically stepped down its output power. The monitoring display flagged the change in amber. Two investors in the front row were looking at the screen at exactly that moment. One said, "What's the amber indicator?" Charlotte explained it as an automated thermal management response within safety parameters. 40 seconds later, a pressure relief valve opened ahead of schedule. A brief white discharge from a secondary port, minimal, but visible. The combined effect produced exactly the atmosphere Charlotte had spent 2 years working to avoid. Abigail Monroe said, "If this system's thermal management triggers under standard load, what does that mean for fleet reliability?" Connor moved to manage the narrative, attributed the behavior to conservative demonstration parameters. Tyler looked at his shoes. Samuel Grant turned in his chair and looked toward the exit that led to the auxiliary corridor. When Samuel said he wanted to see the other engine run under the same load parameters, Connor objected. Uncertified prototype, no institutional backing, insufficient testing history. Samuel said, "I didn't ask your opinion of the engineering. I asked to see it run." Charlotte looked at the monitoring screen still showing the amber flag. She made a calculation. She said, "Bring it in. Same load parameters. His equipment, his risk." From the auxiliary corridor, Mason heard his name. He looked at Hannah. She was standing very straight, holding the notebook with both hands. He picked up the equipment case and walked toward the main floor. The wheels of the utility cart made a different sound on the polished main floor. The room's attention reoriented. Against the clean lines of Bancroft's staging, the engine looked like a working document beside a finished presentation. Connor stated the conditions loudly. Same load parameters, no unauthorized modifications, no unvetted software. Mason said he needed only his mechanical interface and an independent power measurement device. He produced a one-page technical spec. A facility engineer confirmed the interface was standard. Charlotte watched Mason move around the engine, and for the first time, noticed what she had not made room to notice before. He moved in the precise, unhurried way of someone who had performed these checks more times than they could count. He wasn't performing competence. He was exercising it. She had a feeling she did not like, which was the feeling of having been wrong. Before the engine started, Mason said only this: the engine had been built for real operating conditions, not demonstration conditions. It optimized for stability under load variation, the kind that happened in actual work, on grades, with variable payloads, in heat and dust. He had built it to be fixed with ordinary tools by ordinary people. If anyone wanted to understand the design, he would explain every component. Someone near the back said, "Just run it." He ran it. The initial sound was lower and rougher than Bancroft's prototype. A few people exchanged small smiles. Connor's expression was the attentive look of a man who had decided he would find fault and was waiting. Within 10 seconds, the sound smoothed into a consistent register, not impressive in the way of polished things, but impressive in the way of things that work properly. Temperature, nominal. Pressure, nominal. Output matching the load draw. The sequence advanced to heavy load, the same phase where Bancroft's prototype had produced the amber flag, the power reduction, the early valve release. The room held the memory of that. Mason did not look at the screen. He looked at the engine. He put 2 fingers against the housing and felt what was happening inside. His fingers were still. Nothing happened that he had not expected. Output stayed constant. Temperature reached a plateau and held. The efficiency figure on the screen began to differentiate fuel consumption per unit of output measurably lower than the adjacent Bancroft column. Abigail Monroe stood up and walked to the monitoring screen. She looked at the numbers without intermediary interpretation. Charlotte had stopped crossing her arms. She stood with her hands at her sides. A second engineer said quietly, "The valve reacted faster than electronic actuation would have." The first said, "It's mechanical," as if that explained something important. Connor asked for sensor confirmation. Same equipment used for the Bancroft demonstration. He suggested the comparison was complicated by different starting conditions. The engineer said, audibly, "The comparison is fine." Connor said nothing. When Abigail Monroe asked if the engine could run the sustained load phase, Connor said that was outside agreed parameters. Abigail said, "I know. Can it run it?" Mason looked at the engine. He said, "Yes." The sustained phase ran 16 minutes. The room stayed. During that time, Mason answered questions without a presentation or slides. He explained why conventional hybrid systems lost efficiency under variable load. Most systems anticipated load changes through their control software, performing well when conditions were predictable and losing efficiency when conditions were not. His recovery loop captured energy wasted during load transitions. His mechanical valve responded to physical conditions directly, not to a sensor reading that had to be processed first. The lag in conventional systems was small, but cumulative across a full-duty cycle. It added up. An investor asked why large manufacturers hadn't pursued this approach. Mason said engineering organizations of significant size were structured around existing supplier relationships, existing tooling, and product timelines set by business cycles rather than technical readiness. He had the advantage of no existing architecture and no supplier relationships. Charlotte heard that answer and recognized the description. Some portion of it had shaped the decisions that produced the amber flag that morning. Connor pressed from a different angle. Long-term durability data. Mason produced a small plastic bin from the equipment case containing labeled components, a cracked valve seat, seized bearing races, a combustion chamber liner with heat fractures, each dated and annotated. He said, "I don't hide failures. I keep them to remember why the current version is still running." The room was quiet with a quality different from before. Before, it had been judgment in suspension. Now it had the texture of reassessment. Samuel Grant asked how Mason had financed the development. Vehicle repair work, 6 days a week. Weekend contracting. He had sold his late wife's truck to fund the 4th prototype. He had declined 2 acquisition offers that would have transferred control to companies he did not trust to develop the design honestly. Hannah, standing near a column, heard the mention of her mother's truck and looked down at the notebook. Charlotte noticed, and this time did not look away. Julian Reeves, the patent attorney accompanying Abigail Monroe, asked about intellectual property protections. Connor interjected that technology demonstrated at Bancroft Motion events was subject to certain review provisions. Julian said he had read the agreement. The review provision applied to technology submitted for Bancroft's internal development review program. Mason had submitted as an independent exhibitor. Different category, different terms. Mason had filed a provisional patent 11 weeks earlier. Priority date established. The room understood what this meant. Mason was not a man asking for a chance. He was a man holding a protected asset. Samuel Grant said, "A factory can be purchased. The understanding of why something works is not transferable through an acquisition." Abigail Monroe said, "I'd like to make a first offer. $5 million for commercial licensing rights in the industrial clean equipment sector, with Mason retaining full design ownership and a lead technical role." Mason stood beside the engine, listening to numbers offered in his direction, with the expression of a man who was not surprised but needed a moment to establish that what was happening was real. Within 90 seconds, a consortium raised the offer to $8 million for last-mile urban delivery fleet application rights. Then an energy infrastructure fund proposed $18 million for emergency generation and agricultural power systems, the 2 applications Mason had named first, in the auxiliary room, when almost no one was listening. Samuel Grant made his move. $25 million. Structured not as an acquisition but as a development and protection package funding for full certification, an engineering team, a production-ready testing facility, with Mason's technical authority and founder rights intact. Charlotte understood what Samuel's offer represented. If Bancroft Motion did not act, the most compelling engineering story of the year would walk out the door with someone else's backing. She walked to Mason. She looked at him directly and said, "I'd like to discuss a production partnership, Bancroft's facilities, testing resources, supply chain, and distribution in exchange for a co-development agreement on one product line, with your technical standards governing the process." Mason looked at her for a long moment. He did not speak. Samuel Grant, from across the room, said, "Charlotte, are you making this offer because you believe in him, or because you're afraid of losing him?" The question was surgical. It required an honest answer from a woman who had spent the morning in a room full of people who needed her to appear unafraid. Charlotte looked at Samuel. She looked at Mason. She looked at Hannah, who was watching everything from near the column. Charlotte said, "I made an error this morning. I evaluated a piece of engineering by the condition of its casing and the profession of the man who built it. That was wrong, and it was the same error my engineering team made 22 months ago. And I let the culture that makes that error possible continue inside my company." She said, "I'm not saying this to get the deal. I'm saying it because it's true," Hannah said from near the column. "My dad doesn't need you to think his engine is worth something. He just needed you to not call it garbage." Charlotte looked at the child. She said, "You're right, and I'm sorry." The bidding resumed with a different quality. The Energy Infrastructure Fund raised its offer to $30 million. A logistics corporation countered with $35 million for priority freight vehicle rights. Samuel Grant and Abigail Monroe began a bilateral conversation that excluded the other bidders, the kind that happens when two serious parties recognize that combining forces is more productive than competing against each other. Julian Reeves moved to Mason's side and said quietly, "Sign nothing today. Not until you have your own counsel review every term." Mason said, "I know." Julian looked at him with mild surprise. Mason said, "I've been waiting 6 years. I'm not going to stop reading carefully now." The number Samuel and Abigail arrived at together was $50 million, $15 million in operating capital for Whitlock Drive Systems, $20 million for full certification testing, regulatory compliance, and pilot production infrastructure, $10 million for patent protection and legal defense, ensuring the design could not be acquired and suppressed by a larger competitor, $5 million in a protected trust for Hannah's education and medical needs, the condition requiring no negotiation. Mason would retain technical authority over the development process. The $50 million figure did not appear because the engine was worth $50 million as a single object. It appeared because 6 years of documented development, a defended intellectual property position, 600 hours of operational data, and a man who had demonstrated in front of every investor in the building that he understood his subject from the inside out assembled together. That package was worth $50 million to people whose job it was to evaluate such things. When Samuel stated the final package publicly, the room absorbed it. There is a category of silence that significant money produces when it is real enough to require adjustment by everyone present, including the person receiving it. Mason looked at the number on the screen. He looked at his engine still running steadily. He looked at Hannah. She was crying very quietly, not from distress, holding the sketchbook with both arms. He walked off the staging area and crouched in front of his daughter. He said, "Your mom would want us to read every page of the contract before we sign it." Hannah laughed and cried at the same time, the way people do when relief and grief arrive together. Around them, the room exhaled. The revelation about Connor Blake did not produce a dramatic confrontation. By the time Julian Reeves confirmed the sequence through the junior researcher's account and the document trail in Bancroft's internal system, the outcome was not in doubt. Connor had received a technical summary from Mason submitted through a program Connor oversaw and had filed it as insufficient technical basis without disclosure when related development work later began. He had not stolen the design in any precise legal sense, but he had seen the idea, decided the person proposing it was beneath consideration, and used his institutional authority to ensure no one else looked at it either. When Mason appeared at the event, Connor had worked to contain him not because the engine was bad, but because the engine being good would be a problem for the morning he had planned. Charlotte asked why he hadn't disclosed the submission. Connor said there were hundreds of external submissions each year. The standard for engagement was technical credibility, supported by institutional backing. A mechanic's proposal wasn't a credible submission under that standard. Charlotte said, "That standard is what I'm changing." Samuel Grant said, "Technology doesn't die from lack of funding. It dies because the people with authority won't look at hands that are stained with work." Charlotte suspended Connor from all active projects, announced an internal review of the entire submission process, and committed Bancroft Motion to establishing a structured independent inventor evaluation program with a transparent technical review board and published criteria that did not include educational institution as a qualification category. Connor left. The conversation about his professional future would happen elsewhere, in the way that accurate consequences do when they are proportioned to actual conduct. Charlotte walked to where Mason and Hannah were standing. She crouched to Hannah's eye level. She said, "I made you feel ashamed of your father this morning. That was the worst thing I did today, and I'm sorry for it." Hannah looked at her father first. Mason nodded. Hannah looked back at Charlotte. "My dad doesn't need you to think he's rich. He just needed you to not call his stuff garbage." Charlotte accepted it. She turned to Mason. "I judged your engine by what it looked like. I judged you the same way. I did it because it was easy and because I had the authority to do it without anyone stopping me. I'm sorry." Mason was quiet. Then, "I don't need the moment back. You can't return it. But you can make sure no one else who walks in here gets treated that way." Charlotte said, "I will." In the weeks that followed, Mason read everything. He reviewed the draft term sheets with the attention he gave to stress calculations. He hired a patent attorney and a contract attorney and paid for both from the provisional advance Samuel Grant's fund released within 10 days. He used the same advance to bring his mortgage current, and the specific category of anxiety that had been living in his chest for 14 months began to lift. Charlotte came to the garage. She drove herself, without her communications team, and stood outside the door for longer than was strictly necessary before she knocked. Mason let her in. The garage looked the same. The workbench, the battered notebook, the organized salvaged parts, and carefully labeled failed components. The photographs on the shelf. The calendar still had Hannah's medical appointments marked in red pen. Charlotte moved through the space, slowly. She read the labels on the failed components. She looked at the handwritten calculations. She understood, in a way that was different from intellectual understanding, that the engine had not been built from ambition. It had been built from survival, love, and the stubbornness of a person who had decided that other people's assessments of his work were not the final word. Hannah appeared and asked, "Do you still think my dad's engine is ugly?" Charlotte said, "I never thought it was ugly. I didn't know how to look at it." Hannah decided this was honest, and she came in and opened her mother's notebook to a page near the back, a rough drawing of the engine's first iteration, with a note in Rebecca's handwriting underneath. "This is going to work. I don't know all the reasons yet, but I know this." Charlotte read it twice. She asked who had written it. Hannah said, "My mom, the year before she got sick." Charlotte was quiet. Then, "She was right." Hannah said, "I know." That evening, Mason and Charlotte talked for a long time outside. Charlotte told him that her father had started Bancroft Motion in a workspace not much larger than this garage, with used equipment and a design he'd refined over 4 years before any investor took him seriously. After he died, she had felt the need to become something no one could question. Polished, decisive, never uncertain, because the board she inherited was full of men waiting for her to be what they expected a 26-year-old woman to be. She said, "I ended up performing the confidence instead of building it, and I stopped being able to tell the difference." Mason didn't offer absolution. He told her that the difference between performing competence and having it was the same as the difference between a machine designed for a demonstration and a machine designed for work. Both could produce impressive output in controlled conditions. Only one held up when conditions changed. He told her his conditions for any working relationship: technical decision-making authority, an engineering team that included experienced tradespeople alongside credentialed engineers, as a matter of functional practice, and a portion of future proceeds allocated to respiratory health programs for children in industrial communities. Charlotte accepted all three and signed a letter of intent incorporating them as binding requirements. This was where the respect between them began, not from the morning's drama, not from the 50 million, and not from the apology. It began in an agreement that treated the conditions as real. Whitlock Drive Systems was incorporated. Mason became founder and chief technical officer. Bancroft Motion entered as a production partner under terms requiring Mason standards before any licensing arrangement activated. On the day the structure was finalized, Mason drove to the address he had been carrying in his wallet for 9 months, the family who had bought Rebecca's truck when he'd sold it. He knocked on the door, explained the situation, and arrived at a price. He drove the truck home that evening. When Hannah came outside and saw it, she was very still. Then she went and placed her mother's notebook carefully on the passenger seat. She said, "We should keep it here when we go places." Mason said, "We should." 8 months later, the first testing facility operated by Whitlock Drive Systems was running full shifts. It was not a large facility, a converted industrial space with good ventilation, adequate power infrastructure, and enough room for 2 parallel testing rigs and a machine shop. Half the engineering staff had advanced degrees. The other half had decades of hands-on experience. They worked at the same tables because Mason had decided that the most important conversations happened between the person who understood the theory and the person who had felt what happened when the theory met the material. Mason wore work clothes. He owned one suit for quarterly investor briefings and wore it with the slight self-consciousness of someone dressed as someone else. On every other day, he wore the same shirts he had worn in the garage, because the work was the same work, and he wanted to remember that. Charlotte Bancroft arrived on the morning of the first full production load test in a role she had defined carefully: strategic partner, not authority. She arrived early, without a media team. Introduced to the full staff, she said, "I was wrong about the engine the first time I saw it. I was wrong about the engineer. I'm here today to make sure that error is the last one this company makes in that direction." A group of students from 3 regional vocational training programs stood at the viewing window, watching a machine run. Mason had requested their presence. He wanted them to see that a person who learned to work with their hands in a place without prestige could, given enough time and refusal to accept other people's assessments of his value, make something that the people at the top of an industry would need. Hannah stood at the front of the group, wearing a lanyard that said Chief Believer, a designation the engineering team had invented and presented to her in a brief ceremony the week before. She was healthier. The most recent pulmonologist visit had gone well. Abigail Monroe announced that the first application deployment would begin trials in 6 months. Emergency power generation units at 6 rural hospitals in 3 states, and a fleet of delivery vehicles in 2 urban logistics networks. Not display, use. Connor Blake had left Bancroft Motion. The Independent Inventor Evaluation Program had launched with a 3-person technical review board, published criteria, and a publicly accessible submission portal. In its first quarter, it had received 412 submissions. After the test concluded, Mason and Charlotte stood outside the building in the late afternoon. The light was the kind that comes in autumn in Michigan, direct and warm, and carrying the first undertone of what would follow. Charlotte said, "I used to think the future had to look polished before anyone would trust it." Mason looked at the truck in the parking lot, at the notebook visible through the passenger window, at the facility behind them. He said, "Sometimes the future starts in a dark garage, as long as someone doesn't turn off the light." Charlotte was quiet. "Then, I turned off a few lights." Mason said, "You turned some back on." Hannah appeared through the facility door, crossed the parking lot, and took her father's hand. She looked at Charlotte and said, "Do you want to hear what it sounds like when it's running? You can hear it better through the side window." Charlotte smiled genuinely, without management. She said she would like that. They went back inside. The engine was still running. The sound came through the safety glass in layers, the low continuous register of the drive cycle, the slight harmonic shift when the load stepped, the settling back to equilibrium that Mason had designed into the recovery system after the 4th prototype finally taught him what equilibrium sounded like when it was actually achieved. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of something doing what it was supposed to do. Mason stood behind his daughter and Charlotte, who were both looking through the viewing window, and he let himself be still. He thought about the 3 a.m. cycles, about the phone call from the bank, about Hannah's question about the house. He thought about the moment on the exhibition floor when Charlotte's words had landed on his daughter. He thought about Rebecca's notebook and the line that said, "This is going to work. I don't know all the reasons yet, but I know this." He thought about every time someone had dismissed the engine or dismissed him, and about the choice he had made each time to stay, Not because he was certain it would lead anywhere, but because leaving would have meant accepting someone else's assessment of the value of what he was doing, and he knew that assessment to be wrong. People had laughed at Mason Whitlock's engine because it looked assembled from salvage, because it came from a garage, because the man who built it wore oil-stained clothes and had no institutional affiliations. What they had not known, what they had not taken the trouble to find out, was what it actually did, and what it had been built from. Failures kept and labeled and learned from, nights without sleep, a dead woman's belief preserved in a composition notebook, a child who refused to let her father give up, and a refusal to let someone else's contempt become the final word on what he was worth. There are things in the world that begin in the places no one is watching. They begin at the wrong time, in the wrong conditions, by someone with the wrong credentials. They begin as something that can be laughed at. And then, if the person holding them has enough to hold on, if they stay when the easier thing is to go, they become what they always were, which is to say, they become what was real in them from the beginning, waiting only for someone to look closely enough to see it. The engine ran. The numbers held. The light stayed on.